We're all very honored tonight to have with us Amos Oz. I won't launch into any long biographical account of him. Certainly one of the most eminent poets and novelists of Israel right now. His life has some very striking aspects. He was in both of the wars. I just learned tonight that it was as a young man that he actually decided to leave the comfortable life of a middle-class home in Jerusalem to go to a kibbutz and spend his life there, and that he still lives in a kibbutz. And I haven't yet had the opportunity to read the whole of his new book, In the Land of Israel. I have managed to see some parts of it, and I was deeply stirred by what I read. For one thing, it seems to be a new kind of genre of literature. It's some might call it journalism, but it's not normal Norman Mailer sort of, literary journalism. It's not just reportage. It's sort of a panorama snapshot of Israel at this point in time in terms of people's voices, what people are saying. And I've been in Israel a few times. My experience there has been limited, but to me it sounds very authentic. It corresponds to much of what I've heard when I've been in Israel. Having Israeli relatives, we have gotten a bit into the society. What I see in the book, first of all, underlying it all, is really a passionate love of Israel, but alongside of this exasperation and agony and picture of people being frozen into positions. And yet somehow even that seems to me a little bit more hopeful than in some other. I think this business of people being locked into fixed positions, into ideas that we've inherited from the 19th and 20th century and not being able to move out of them, is by no means confined to Israel. And from reading Amos Oz's account of some of these dialogues, the fact that everybody was screaming, I found myself screaming at times in Israel, and I'm not a screamer by nature, it was an indication to me somehow that they really did catch the point of their opponent, but they were screaming sort of to drown it. It wasn't this sort of shutting out of everybody else's view, but really they're so they really see the point of their opponent so well that they're extremely exasperated. In other words, I think there is communication in a way. This doesn't solve all of Israel's problems by any means, but this is one of the things that I got from the book. Not from the book, from the parts of the book I read, and as I read it, of course, I brought a further complication to it. That is that of an American Jew trying to relate all this to all this, and that brings a further complication to all the complications in the book. Like many American Jews, I think some of us have found when we read things such as Amos Oz writes, that we have opinions on everything he says. And frankly, I'm not apologetic about having opinions about everything he says. If I write a book about France that went about it the same way, I'm sure I would have opinions about everything that was said. And because I am deeply committed to the people of Israel, I therefore am more immersed in having opinions about what is said. And I think, if I may say just a word to Mr. Oz about the American Jewish scene, I don't know how interested he is in that, but I do think that there has been somewhat of a turn in the whole atmosphere of our relations to Israel. I don't think it's a turn on the part of the majority of the community, but a turn on of enough of a minority of the community to put the issue on the agenda, even for the majority. That is, can we go on in our past relation with Israel, which was generally one of automatically supporting government policy, policies, and two being fundraisers. And now looking back on this, I have a feeling that this is a way of distancing American Jews from Israel. It was a way when somehow, because one supported government automatically, because one gave funds, one really didn't have to relate oneself to the rich context of Israeli life, the context which is described in Amos Oz's book. Well, some of us have begun to do that, but as is usual among Jews, that doesn't mean that even those who no longer accept the old relationship all agree with each other. And I'll end by pointing out one, I think, difference that perhaps has emerged in our community. I mean, among those who feel that the old approach was not adequate, there are those who feel that we Jews should take active role in all the issues that are raised in Amos Oz's book. I still myself have a somewhat more conservative position on that. As far as the future shape of Israel in terms of all its internal economic and social and cultural problems, I really do still think there is a point in the view, well, if you want to play a part in that, you have to go to Israel in the end. That is, I allow myself to have opinions on all these matters, but I'm not sure I would form myself an organization to reshape the entire future life of Israel. But some of us feel, nevertheless, who don't share this particular point of view, that there is at least one issue which is so overriding and so desperate and so lamentable that we have to relate ourselves to this issue. And that is, to my mind, it overrides all other considerations. For a person who is loyal to Israel and who has our point of view, it overrides all other considerations, and I'm here identifying myself as a friend of peace now, namely the issue of the urgent issue of the de facto annexation of the West Bank by organized settlements. Urgent because it's an issue. You know, there's a prejudice in the United States against one-issue politics. But sometimes there's an issue that arises in the course of human events that's so overriding that it's the issue, really. It's urgent because unless something happens, then maybe the whole thing will be foreclosed. And I draw courage to take this position because it is not just a question of people sitting here in Cambridge and Dorchester and Roxbury and on the basis of our own wisdom feeling that this issue is desperate, but also we draw comfort. In fact, we draw most of our arguments from Israelis. They may not be the majority in Israel, but they are a pretty substantial minority. They are people who know the situation in Israel, who have as real things to say about Israel's security situation as anybody who sits in a bureaucratic office in Israel. So that now I'm not saying all of this in order to try to influence Amos Oz to say anything on this subject. We don't know what he's going to talk about. Yes, all right. Frankly, I just put it in because I had an opportunity to do so. We have the great pleasure of welcoming Amos Oz.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, my dear friend, for this heartwarming introduction, especially for the bit on Norman Mailer. And as for the extent of my interest in Israeli diaspora-Jewish relationship, you just wait a few minutes and you will see for yourself. Dear friends, good evening to you all. Shalom, Erev Tov. In fact, I have no one set subject for this talk, and I have deliberately, vaguely entitled it Certain Israeli Perspectives. I intend to deal mostly with Israel's past and present self-image, with certain attitudes toward Israel from the outside world, and at some length indeed, with the relationship between Israel and the Jewish diasporas. I know all of you are dying to hear from me on the settlements in the West Bank, Peace Now, Gush Emunim, Labor, Likud, and all that, but this bit will have to wait for the question and answer period because I want to get to the more substantial stuff first. Now, all of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the old story about the ignorant peasant who went to the zoo for the first time in his life. Eventually, that peasant stopped by the giraffe's cage, watched the animal for some half an hour with ever-increasing rage, finally turned his back to it, and shrugging his shoulders, he mumbled angrily, "There is no such animal." This old story keeps coming back to my mind whenever I think of the powerful, complex, mysterious emotion which Israel evokes everywhere, every day, in the hearts of hundreds of millions of human beings. Moreover, this story comes back to my mind even when I try to decipher the ambivalence, the intensity, the passion, and the irritation which Israel evokes in the hearts of diaspora Jews, Orthodox, secular, and assimilated, Zionists, non-Zionists, and anti-Zionists. For us Israelis, you should know, there is this perpetual sensation of being scrutinized by a huge international audience, a strangely excited auditorium, watching the drama that is Israel, expecting us, perhaps, either to produce a couple of daily miracles or else to crash with a big bang, much like a crowd gathering in the street to watch a person walking on a high ledge of a skyscraper. Diaspora Jews are naturally the most involved part of this international audience, the most enthusiastic miracle consumers, the most vehement theater critics, and sometimes the most aggressive opponents of some aspects of modern Israel or of the Zionist enterprise altogether. I cannot simply ascribe this universal emotional intensity toward Israel to the obvious political surface, namely the explosiveness of the conflict in the Middle East, etc. No. I have the feeling that something different, something deep and dark is lurking underneath most of the spectrum of attitudes and expectations. Let me make it very clear. I do not regard the miracle consumers necessarily as friends and lovers of Israel, just as I do not simply rate the crash prophets as enemies, anti-Semites, or self-hating Jews. Even though, let me add in parentheses, good old anti-Semitism is alive and well and kicking hard. And as for Jewish self-hatred, it seems to be healthier than ever. In fact, historically, the extreme right wing everywhere is traditionally anti-Semitic. The extreme left wing everywhere has always been anti-Zionist, whereas the socialist, social democratic, and liberal center used to be sympathetic. But recently, we Israelis get the claustrophobic feeling that the fringes, right and left, are sort of closing in on us, and the friendly milieu is being squeezed in between. But let me close these parentheses and get back to my key point. Why is Israel such a dramatic, such a highly emotional issue with hundreds of millions of human beings? Why should the Washington Post, for example, print so passionately on its world news page the cataclysmic wire from its Jerusalem correspondent about 4 olive tree saplings which were uprooted near an Arab village on the West Bank, allegedly by Gush Emunim people from a nearby settlement? 4 olive saplings, world news. Well, because of the colossal expectations, I say. Because Israel is some kind of a symbol to everyone. Because of the almost universal gut feeling that Israel should produce and deliver one kind or another of dazzling light, or else crush and go down the drain altogether. Some spectators expect Israel to be the most Christian, if not the only Christian nation on earth, in the way of turning the other cheek. Others want Israel to be an eternal cross between David and Goliath, presenting some kind of a non-stop heroic macho show. Still others expect it to be the spearhead of Western civilization, or the personification of Yiddishkeit values, or a reconstruction of romantic Oriental biblicality, or the taste tube of world socialism, or maybe a surrealistic combination of all these things put in one nutshell. Now, I'm aware of the fact that the creation and the existence of Israel are a standing challenge to almost every existing dogma and theory in the world. It is an abomination for dogmatic Catholicism and a theological enigma for millions of other Christians who were always taught to link the rebirth of Jerusalem with the conversion of the Jews. It is an impossibility for a dogmatic Marxist. It is a pain in the neck for a Toynbeist who believes in a biological or perhaps a botanical cycle of civilizations. For those, we are but a living ghost. It is a troubling mystery even for a sheer down-to-earth pragmatist, as the creation and existence of Israel are impossible to conceive in strictly pragmatic terms. And so on. So that if, heaven forbid, Israel collapses, hundreds of millions would have their various theories put straight for them again and would be able to say, not necessarily with anti-Semitic malice, they simply couldn't get away with it, or perhaps it was too good to last, or haven't we always told them? And our peasant would be at last be satisfied that such an animal does indeed not exist. Moreover, from a certain Jewish religious point of view, the creation of modern Israel by a secular political movement rather than by the Messiah is, to say the least, a baffling phenomenon. And how about Israel's significance for diaspora Jews? Does she not evoke a perpetual complex of feelings, shame and pride and guilt and envy and embarrassment and security and worrying and whatnot? Perhaps things got even more confusing for you, for us, and for our mutual relationship altogether since the three major turning points: the Six-Day War, the Yom Kippur War, and the Lebanon War. The results of the Six-Day War evoked a kind of euphoria, not only in Israel itself, but also throughout the Jewish world, an intoxication with the power of power, a strange celebration of the Exodus type of a Gentile Jew, a Jewish John Wayne personified by our military heroes, a tough and simple Shegetz working out in the fields all day, making wild love in the evening, then picking up his submachine gun and going out to smash the hostile Red Indians or Arabs before his day is done. This monstrous stereotype, beaming with glee and macho, was born from the depth of Jewish self-hatred, the secret wish to resemble our tormentors. It was indeed produced and packed and exported by Israeli propaganda and by third-rate Israeli literature at the passionate invitation of diaspora Jewish consumers. Then, after the Yom Kippur War, some of them, in so many words, simply wanted their money back. The Yom Kippur War marks the collapse of Israel's self-image as a dazzling success story and the decline of Israel's universal reputation of a success story in the eyes of friends and enemies alike. Second thoughts, hesitations, criticisms had become legitimate and even trendy almost everywhere. Then came the, in my view, unjustifiable invasion of Lebanon, which divided Israel itself in an unprecedented way, and made the relationship between her and diaspora Jewry both harder and easier for diaspora Jews. The subterranean argument between the Zionist idea and its enemies, a battle which was subdued since Hitler, hushed by the creation of the independent Jewish state, censored because of the existential threat which has faced Israel for decades, muted by Israel's dazzling successes during her first 25 years, this battle is now openly rejoined. Our angry peasant once more proclaims that there is no such animal, or cannot be, or should not be. Before I go on, let me state here loud and clear. I am a Zionist. I still think that Zionism is essentially the healthiest, brightest, most healing idea which dawned on the tormented Jewish mind in the last 2,000 years. I am not going to review the battle between Israel and its Jewish and non-Jewish opponents as a scientific analyst, nor as a scholarly observer, but as a committed Zionist. Indeed, I view Zionism as a surname, not as a first name. Zionism is a tensed and divided federation of conflicting and even contradicting dreams, an uneasy coalition of master plans. Israel, I would say, if you only take it with a grain of salt, is neither a nation nor a country. It is a collection of arguments. An assembly of 4 million prime ministers, if not 4 million self-appointed prophets, each one with his or her personal formula for an instant universal salvation, or at least for a Jewish redemption in 3 easy steps. It is, I sense, the most talkative, the most passionate, polyphonic society in the world. And although it costs me a lot of rage, and although one comes across the most outrageous opinions, one cannot avoid the gut feeling that Israel had got as close as any country to Aristotle's ancient vision of a small pluralistic polis with the highest degree of personal involvement in public affairs. Everyone is a messiah. Everyone knows better. Everyone is screaming at the top of their lungs, though very few really listen. And frankly, I do not exclude myself sometimes. Let me dwell, or in fact let me add here, that while gathering the materials for my new book, In the Land of Israel, I had the chance to talk to the most enthusiastic North African Beginites. And I tended to think initially that those people are blind followers of Begin. Once I really had the chance, or initiated the chance, to listen to those people, I realized that what each and every one of them really wanted is just 5 minutes with Mr. Begin so as to give him the right ideas. And mind you, some of them had the right ideas. Let me dwell now for a couple of moments on some of the major trends in Zionism, or if you wish, some of the major characters in the Israeli live theater. Initially, of course, Israel was created by a handful of dreamers who had more political parties, more ideological tendencies, more splinter groups than individual members, because each one of those founding fathers had a divided mind and a split soul. There were initially those whom I'm afraid I'll have to define as semi-religious social anarchists. Sorry, but that's what they were. They were those who came to Palestine at the turn of the century, hoping to turn it neither into a nation nor into a country, but into a loose federation of rural communities where people are involved in physical labor close to the elemental relationship with the land, with the elements, with God himself. They didn't even have a nation state in mind, and some of them strongly opposed the idea of nation state. Almost next door to them, there were the Marxists, those rejected sons and lovers of the Great October Revolution in Russia, who really knew better, and who secretly dreamt for most of their lives that one day they'll have a chance to enlighten Stalin on real communism, to have him for a quick visit in one of the kibbutzim, show him around, drag him into a lengthy symposium in juicy Russian on Marxism, Leninism in the communal dining hall, teaching him once and for all what it is all about, because they knew better, and I'm not being ironical, they really knew better. And toward dawn, at the end of this Dostoevsky and soul-searching discussion, they'll have Stalin stand on his feet and say in juicy Russian, "Bloody Jews, I have to admit you did it better here than we did in Russia," and then die of happiness. And if I do sound slightly ironical about those people, I guess you know that I love them. Moreover, next door to those Marxists, we had the Central Europeans, those who wanted to turn the Holy Land into a replica of peaceful Franz Joseph's Austro-Hungaria, with red tiled roofs and peace and quiet between 2 and 4 and a lot of Gemütlichkeit and Bavaria cream and Frau Direktor and Herr Doktor. And next to those, we had the, what shall I call them? The Polish horsemen, those who were educated in nationalistic, chauvinistic, self-indulgent Poland between the 2 world wars and transplanted this romantic cavalry attitude right into the Zionist drama. We had the ultra-Orthodox, who really came to the Holy Land not for Zionism, but in order to stop Zionism. And all they wanted was to sit there peacefully and humbly expect the Messiah. There were the other Orthodox, who intended to play themselves the role of the Messiah, or at least to drag him by his beard to come right away, Messiah Achshav. And they are, of course, the spiritual mentors of Gush Emunim. There were many. There were those North Africans, and I focus on the North Africans rather than on the Sephardi community in general. I think the generalization is wrong. A community which had brought with her into Israel very French-inspired, 19th century French-inspired ethos, system of values and aspirations, a respectable, conservative, family-oriented society, somewhat traditional but not fanatically religious, somewhat xenophobic, very nationalistic, and they opted really for not for an egalitarian prime minister with an open neck shirt and khaki shorts, but for a respectable one who wears a proper tie and a proper suit and kisses ladies' hands and talks to the Gentiles in the only language the Gentiles understand. And they finally got what they wanted. But I should not let myself be carried away, as I could easily spend the rest of tonight or maybe write a trilogy on the polyphony that is Israel. I want you to know that for all the sound and the fury and the pain, one can feel a certain pride about the fact that although we Israelis are giving each other ulcers and heart attacks, we did not have, and we do not have, and we are not likely to have a civil war. We had, as you all know, episodes, terrible episodes of political violence. And obviously we are not immune to such episodes in the future. Yet you have to bear in mind that many other nations, including this blessed America, only managed to decide their identity and a certain degree of common ethos through a civil war, and only established their political rules of the game through blood and fire. The constant Israeli civil war is essentially a verbal one, with verbal artillery and verbal bloodshed and verbal victims. In short, a traditional Jewish battle. I shall never forget my own experience again while gathering the materials for this present book in a place called Beit Shemesh, which is by and large a North African developing town established in the 50s, strongly pro-Begin, where I just came without any pre-arrangements and set myself in a street cafe and engaged myself in conversation with people who quite soon recognized who I was because of television. And while saying to me that I should have been shot at, hanged, drawn, and quartered for being a leftist, a defeatist, an Ashkenazi, a kibbutznik, a peace now, whatever, while saying that to me, those people were pouring me with loving kindness. offering me endless cups of coffee and insisting on paying for me, lighting my cigarettes for me, sometimes even before I finished the one I was smoking, showering with me with Mediterranean warmth, passionate really to save my soul for me, not to kill me. Now this is at least a clue of encouragement. And it doesn't neatly fall into any trite classification of the Israelis. It would have been immensely comfortable for international press and media if any Sephardi Jew would comfortably also be a Beginite, a religious zealot, and a settler on the West Bank, and the other way around. Happily for Israel, it does not at all work this way. And the scene is a lot more complex, and there is a lot more of a cross-section between the various dovish and, on the other hand, the various hawkish groups in Israel. Diagnosis, prescription, gradual process of recovery. This will be my description of the Zionist idea by and large. The initial diagnosis, as you probably know, was that diaspora existence is both dangerous and corrupting. Their prescription involved normalization, nationhood, and a radical change of traditional Jewish priorities of values. For my kind of a Zionist, the prescription meant, among other things, back to work. The process of gradual recovery meant that the Jews should relax, come to grips with realities, with the normal pace of history rather than with messianic expectations for either instant salvation or else instant calamity. In short, become a less poetic and more prosaic people. I still maintain that the initial diagnosis and the nucleus of the prescription were correct and are still valid. As for the process of recovery, I believe it have gone wrong, indeed very wrong, as a result of the long, painful and mentally distorting conflict with the Arabs. This is not to say that I have a magic formula of how to step out of this conflict in 3 moves. I am not one of those. I am an evolutionist, and I do happen to believe that this conflict has 2 parties. And I do not happen to believe that Israel, even Begin's Israel, is necessarily the nasty party in this conflict. But as I said before, nowadays, diaspora ideology rides again. From various Jewish spokesmen, we Israelis hear that the creation of Israel was a mistake, that perhaps anti-Semitism and even Hitler were but a passing episode. You Zionists, says George Steiner, muddled yourself and muddled the Jewish people in a dubious adventure. We diaspora Jews have no choice now but to help you with your survival. But the price you will have to pay us for this help is that you give up your ambition to offer a radical, comprehensive solution to the Jewish problem. Moreover, in return for massive help from the diaspora, you have to give up your pretension to be the focus of the Jewish people. George Steiner goes even further by saying that a national state per se is a vain, childish, anachronistic, and dangerous concept. And what we should aspire to is Judifying the world, no less than that, mind you, by turning it into an arena of 100 different civilizations without a single nation state. The Jews, says Steiner, whether out of necessity or perhaps of their own volition, had presented a universal model for a non-territorial civilization until you Zionists chose to join the nationalistic 19th century regression. A Jew owning a nation state, says Steiner, is like an old man in a kindergarten full of lethal toys. This argument is accompanied by an aggressive accusation. What have you Israelis done to the Jewish genius? What have you produced, contributed to world culture, except for a handful of colonels and tank drivers? Just compare this with the riches of Jewish creation in the diaspora. We diaspora Jews are the pioneers of culture in almost every sphere. You Israelis are not even a New Zealand. Just a little Levantine country mired in endless fighting, a source of trouble for everybody, Jews, Arabs, and the rest of the world. We Jews, say the new diaspora ideologists, have a special mission to be the vitamin of Western civilization, and vitamins, of course, ought to be scattered, not concentrated. This argument is decorated normally with a panel of medals which these spokesmen proudly display: Maimonides, Spinoza, Marx, Freud, Kafka, Einstein, Saul Bellow, Bashevis, Singer, the physicists, the mathematicians, and it's probably only out of modesty that they don't add their own names to this panel. What, they say, what can you Zionists present as your contribution? Colonels, peasants, and tank drivers. Well, I'm sorry to admit that the usual Zionist reply is fairly miserable. We normally hasten to accuse our rivals of careerism, materialism, even cowardice. Sometimes some of our spokesmen sink so low as to use anti-Semitic cliches in this argument. When we feel really cornered, we even predict and wish a little pogrom on them. The big bad guy will come and hit you, and then your eyes will open to see our light. For their part, diaspora ideologists shell us with their trite paradox. Well, after all, Israel meant to give security to the Jews, to provide them with a safe shelter, but aha, Israel is the least safe place for a Jew nowadays. I shall not use the usual defensive and defeatist Zionist answer, namely that Stanford University is marvelous, but the Weizmann Institute isn't bad either. Saul Bellow is a great fellow, but Amichai is also something. No, I shall try to move right into the heart of the dispute. First of all, security. Let's get this out of the way. No country in the world enjoys total security. Even little Belgium is arming itself with tanks and jet fighters. But the major difference between the Israeli condition and the diaspora Jewish condition is the fact that we are in a position to decide our destiny to a large extent. A Jew in Detroit may feel more secure physically than a Jew in Jerusalem, although I'm not at all sure that he is entitled to feel so. But nonetheless, it's a security granted to him by others. Israel is not fireproof, of course, but if, heaven forbid, there should be a calamity in Israel, it would not be caused by the Cossacks, or the Polish anti-Semites, or the Tsar Nikolai, or the Nazis. A calamity in Israel might, oh yes, it might, be caused by ourselves out of folly, arrogance, or short-sightedness. Now, I believe that part of our freedom, the freedom which we Israeli Jews enjoy and diaspora Jews do not, is the freedom to avoid calamity or to head right into it. Now, freedom is not a condition in which nobody tells you what to do. Freedom, on the national as well as on the individual scale, is a condition where there is a degree of correlation, at least a degree of correlation, between your conduct and its consequences. In this respect, the Jews of Israel achieved already a degree of freedom and security which non-Israeli Jews have never had, not even in this blessed America. Let's turn now to the more humiliating assault on Israel by the anti-Zionists: creativity. Cultural contribution, Marx and Freud and Einstein. Well, I happen to maintain that civilization could theoretically exist in one of two modes, either as a museum or else as a live drama. In a museum, culture, religion, folklore, values, inheritance are neatly arranged in glass cases. And parents take their offspring to show them those assets and try to inspire them, hoping eventually to hand over the keys of the museum to the next generation so that they in turn will bring more visitors. This, in my view, is a dead end. In the last analysis, a graveyard. Because where there is a museum, even a pretty one, but no action, no live drama, the young generation is bound to escape into fresh arenas. New Left, Topamaros, Jews for Jesus, Moonies, you name it. Very few young people would accept the role of museum curator for life. Now, my point is that in all exiles, including America, Jewish culture is essentially becoming a museum. where the only proposition which parents can make to their children is, please do not assimilate. Please go on running the museum. Please be impressed by the riches of the inheritance. The other option, as I said, is live drama. Live drama is no rose garden. It's a perpetual struggle, sound and fury, sometimes even violence. And as I said, a verbal civil war has been the perpetual condition of Israel since the beginning of Zionism, and I happen to like it and enjoy it immensely. But Israel is the only place in the Jewish world now where there is a live drama at work. Now, just how creative and significant is the cultural contribution of Israel? Well, just as I distinguish between museum civilization and live drama civilization, I would like now to introduce the distinction between individual creativity and collective creativity. In terms of individual creativity, the diasporas are obviously well ahead of Israel. More celebrities, more Nobel Prize winners, better writers, perhaps even deeper thinkers. This is only natural. The numbers are not on our side. Time is not on our side. Diaspora has existed for millennia. We have only been there for decades. But if we turn to collective creation, I believe Israel has the lead. I shall go so far as to make the chauvinistic claim that since the destruction of East European Jewry, the only collective Jewish creation takes place in Israel and nowhere else. Now, I am not suggesting that Jewish exile never had periods of collective creativity. There were at least 3 points in time when Jewish diasporas produced magnanimous collective creations. In Babylonia, in medieval Spain, and recently in Eastern Europe. By the way, it may be interesting to point out that the very last major creation of East European Jewry before its final destruction was Zionism itself. Collective creation is not the kind of thing for which someone gets the Nobel Prize, but it is the crucial, fertile ground for the great individual creator as well. And I shall come back to this point. Let me now make a very controversial statement, or what may be a very controversial statement. Since the destruction of Eastern Europe Jewry, the Jews outside Israel as a collective have become almost barren. No religious movement which can compare to Hasidism. No social movement which is nearly as significant as the Bund or even Yiddish communism. No language which is anything like Yiddish, and certainly no political ideological movement which can match Zionism. All diasporas are, since the destruction of Jewish Eastern Europe, nothing but a gilded replicas of collective creations of Eastern Europe. The poor community has become a rich congregation. The synagogue has become a temple. The Rebbe has become a rabbi. The Gabbai is now the temple president. The Parnas is promoted into chairman, the Stadland to spokesman, and the Cheder has become the Sunday school. Thousands of collective institutions, but not a single fresh collective creation. Nothing new. The only place where Jews have produced collective creations in the last few decades is Israel. And let me give you but 3 examples. 1, the modern Hebrew language. Despite the common myth, the revival of Hebrew was not the one-man show of Eliezer ben Yehuda. It is a magnificent collective creation of the Jews of Israel. No one is likely, of course, to get the Nobel Prize for reviving the Hebrew language, but in terms of contribution to civilization, it may be slightly more important than the complete works of this or that Jewish writer, with all due respect to the Nobel Prize Committee. 2, the project of agricultural settlements, foremost among them the kibbutz. The kibbutz has no funding father, fortunately, with a capital F. No guru who could be printed on posters to hang on the wall. Again, no Nobel Prize for this creation either. But isn't it a collective Jewish creation with very deep roots in Jewish heritage, in Jewish spirit, and in the best of Jewish tradition? Isn't it a daring and far-reaching movement for, if anything, reforming and reviving certain aspects of Judaism? Ultimately, isn't the kibbutz an original attempt to revive certain traditional Jewish social sensitivities within a modern technological world and not apart from it? Isn't it the only successful model of an extended family, or else a very tight, small community, operating not as a segregationist sect somewhere away in the desert, but as a major segment of the political and cultural national scene? The kibbutz idea is a revolutionary interpretation of ancient Jewish heritage, enriched, of course, by 19th century East European socialism. But I dare say that the kibbutz is a creation that, viewed through historical perspective, may turn out to be almost every bit as important as Hasidism. 3. The city of Jerusalem. Not the one between the walls, but precisely the New Jerusalem, which is definitely a great collective creation of the Israeli Jews, even though Teddy Kollek may protest and call it his own individual creation. A beautiful, vivacious, and humane city, despite, or perhaps precisely because of, all the tensions that are focused in and around it. Nothing that was created by the American Jewish community, for example, can match these creations. So, American Jews produced a dozen or more Nobel Prize winners, while we created New Jerusalem, the kibbutz, the modern Hebrew language, and so on. Now, I have an important reservation to make here. I don't wish to idealize those creations. All three of my examples are exposed to an immediate threat of corruption. It is not by accident that I regret those it is not by accident that I regard those as some of my own main battlefields within Israel, to protect the Hebrew language from the danger of degeneration, to struggle over the soul of the kibbutz against stagnation, and to defend New Jerusalem from what our barbarians are trying to do to her. So our collective creations in Israel are in constant danger. But isn't that what live drama is all about? There is a struggle precisely because we are not a museum. Now, a George Steiner may view our collective creations in Israel, the three I mentioned and some others, with sardonic condescension. He is entitled to say, ironically, what's the big deal? What you are waving at us is nothing like monotheism, Hasidism, or Babylonian Talmud. Fair enough. As long as the anti-Zionists admit that although we may be fourth-rate theater and they first-rate critics, nonetheless we are the theater and they are only the critics. Israel is the Jewish stage. The diaspora is the auditorium. My next point is that individual creators in the present diaspora are living on a kind of overdraft, drawing from the non-existent bank of Jewish Eastern Europe. Bellow, Malamud, Bashevis Zinger, Steiner himself for the matter, and even Kafka, would not be who they are were it not for Eastern Europe. Let me dwell perhaps on Kafka for a moment or two. There is an apocryphal story, according to which at the end of his life Kafka had not only tried to learn Hebrew, but even considered making Aliyah and inquired about becoming a kibbutz accountant. Just imagine the transformation, or if you wish, the metamorphosis of Franz Kafka into Ephraim Kafri, the accountant of Kibbutz Beit Alpha or something. But my point is that Kafka, of course, had never set foot in any shtetl in Poland, Galicia, or the Ukraine, yet he is what he is because of the cultural hinterland of Eastern Europe. And to be more specific, he is what he is indirectly thanks to Kabbalah and Hasidism. As a young man, he happened to watch some performance of a Yiddish theater company which came to Prague from Poland. He himself described that experience in his diaries as a formative one, saying that he went to see this performance night after night, several times, as if obsessed. Now, I think it must have been a fairly fifth-rate Yiddish theater with folklore, mysticism, ghosts, exorcism, and miracles, probably the usual Yiddish combination of strict mimetic realism with metaphysical fantasy. But then, this is precisely the combination which Kafka is, in his writings, elevated to a masterpiece by redeeming it from its vulgar aspects. Now suppose a new Kafka is growing right now here in Boston. Suppose he is 14-year-old now. Let's call him Chuck Bernstein. Let's assume that he is a genius. His future masterpieces would be Jewish only if he leans on an uncle in Jerusalem or a cousin in some kibbutz. In short, if he is somehow inspired or appalled, for the matter, it doesn't matter, inspired or appalled or attracted or whatever by the Israeli live drama. Otherwise, he will be an American writer of Jewish origin, not a Jewish. He may become a new Faulkner, but not a new Kafka, and certainly not a new Bashevis Singer. In other words, I am suggesting that even individual creation in the future, to the extent that it is going to be Jewish at all, will depend on Israel. As I maintain that in the long run individual creations spring from the fertile ground of collective creation, and as I maintain that perhaps there can be no collective creation in the present diaspora, the only choice for the Jew is either to turn to Israel or to despair of any Jewish future at all. Now, what on earth do I mean by turn to Israel? Obviously, my best offer is climb on the stage, join the collection of arguments, and thus enjoy the challenge of writing the text while acting it out. Whoever maintains that the text is bad or the actors are poor, let him join and steal the show. Steal it in literature, in religion, in ideology, in politics, in the army. Welcome. As a second best, whoever does not want or cannot mount the stage, at least learn Hebrew, so that you can follow the drama without earphones. If you don't do even that, at least try to move toward the front rows of the auditorium. And if even this is too much for you, and I'm paraphrasing now an old Hasidic tale, the very least you can do is turn your seat in the right direction. If you have decided, or if you feel doomed to be cut off from the stage, removed from the language, far from the action, at least recognize where the action is. And I mean the only collective Jewish action right now. Now, live drama is expensive. Being an Israeli is expensive in many ways. You pay with your serenity. You may pay, of course, with your standard of living. It may even cost you your very life. But the only alternative is to spend your life polishing the glass cases of the museum. Yes, I can easily agree with George Steiner that a nation-state is a terrible thing. Living in a Jewish nation-state myself, I sometimes share Steiner's gut feeling of an old man in a kindergarten. Yes, indeed. And yes, I would prefer to live in a world with 100 civilizations and not a single nation-state. But never again shall I volunteer to be the eternal Cape Kennedy for the next phase of history. I shall gladly be the 5th in the neighborhood or the 10th in the world to join the post-nationalist era in history. But no more pioneering in this business, not after Auschwitz. If you wish, this is my Zionism A to Z. Israel may be dangerous, but diaspora existence is disastrous. And finally, at the cost of once more sounding chauvinistic, let me tell you that right now, Israel may be one of the most fascinating places on earth. The Israeli experiment unfolds every trend, almost every social tendency, almost every religious direction in the world on a mini scale, like in a laboratory where processes are speeded up. It is no bed of roses, but every Jew who prefers to miss this experience, to avoid this experiment, to steer clear of this drama, is metaphysically wasting his life. No fortune in the world will buy you such an intensive experience. Oh yes, I say to the peasant with whom I began my talk. Oh yes, such an animal not only exists, but right now it may spiritually be the most vivacious creature in the whole zoo. Even the prosaic everyday life on a kibbutz is a perpetual trip for me. The very fact that I spend my own life in a community whose existence may be clouded very often by endless petty quarrels and gossip, but at the same time fulfills the single most daring dream, or trying to fulfill it, of changing human nature, is a gut joy, though an expensive one, apart from anything else. Well, next week or so I shall be back in a country which is in a great pain, in a society full of sound and fury, among passionate people who will be screaming at me just as I will be screaming at them, not over conflicting interests, mind you, but over conflicting dreams. My own vision of socialist Zionism will probably clash with all sorts of other fascinating or terrifying visions. We shall be, as always, struggling ultimately over the meaning of good and evil, over the purpose of life itself. And what about you? Thank you very much. Well, I will take now as many questions as I physically can, and that may not be very much, but before that, let me issue a warning. I'm invited to talk in Brandeis next week, and I am very likely to talk about the same subject in very similar terms. So whoever happens not to be a masochist, steer clear. Yes. Well, I am urged to urge you to use the microphone here so that everybody can hear the question. Yes, please.
I agree. Testing. I agree with very much of what you have said, but I think you've overlooked one important point about the diaspora. There's much discussion about Judaism as to whether we're a nation or a religion, and many of us believe that we're both. If the religious aspect of Judaism is to be taken into account, there has been one major contribution which Israel has yet to feel the impact of, and that's, although it started in Germany, Reform Judaism, and was nurtured in this country, and then conservative Judaism. Both of these trends have been developed in the diaspora, and maybe for political reasons have not had a chance to have an impact in Israel. But I predict that the Israelis will come to these developments and will receive them, and I think that you're going to see a development, an impact of these activities and developments that have happened in the diaspora, and impact on Israel.
Well, I gratefully accept your correction. I do think that the creation of Reformed Judaism, or the emergence of Reformed Judaism in Germany in the previous century, is a significant collective creation. I am very worried about its present state here in America. I know it's widespread, well institutionalized, but is it really creative? And let me add right away, more than any other Israeli perhaps, I would love to see this spiritual religious phenomenon well transplanted in Israel itself, where it may get a lot of adrenaline. It will be good for us and good for you.
I don't want to start a discussion. Other
Well,
people
why not?
should have.
You are entitled to another one.
I'd like to suggest one specific way that the reforming conservative movement have been creative in the United States, and that's the idea of women in Judaism and creating new ideas of women's ritual within Judaism. And I'd like to know if that kind of thing has been going on in Israel.
Well, let me return the question to you. Before you retire from the microphone, stay where you were. Let me return the question to you and ask you whether you regard this as a political phenomenon or as a spiritual creation altogether, because you certainly know better than I do about it.
it's hard to separate politics and spirituality because they're obviously a way of being, but I think that Judaism has not paid enough attention to women's spirituality. And I think now we're politically at the right time to think about it. And women are starting to create, are being allowed politically to create spiritually.
I couldn't agree more, and I'm very glad that you have opened this aspect for us. I personally maintain that as far as the heavily populated Arab zones occupied by Israel are concerned, even if the heads of the Arab states would have convened tonight and decided for a sudden pulse of Zionism to give it to Israel on a silver plate for free, we should still say no thanks. I know this is a main and crucial soul-searching issue within Israel itself. I believe very strongly that non-Israeli Jews should be involved, and I want to be specific about it. When I say those who do not mount the stage or do not learn the language in order to follow the drama without earphones should at least move toward the front rows, I meant precisely this. I think you should make your voice heard loud and clear on any controversial internal Israeli issue on two conditions. A, never fail to remind your listeners here of your gut solidarity with Israel. B, whenever you address yourselves first to the Israelis. In other words, if you want to sign a petition against the policy of the Israeli government, sign it and send it to the Jerusalem Post to be quoted the next day by the New York Times rather than sign it and send it directly to the New York Times. This is not technical. This is essential. Are you talking to us or are you talking about us? I think it is essential that while making your voice heard loud and clear on this issue, on the issue of the state of women in Israel, on the issue of the condition of reformed and conservative communities in Israel, address yourselves to us rather than talk about us.
This is a related question, and it applies to how diaspora Jews look at Israel. We ask too much if we really ask Israel now to be a light to the nations, but how do you decide the point at which things are going so wrong that you have to complain?
Well, you have to complain even if things go slightly wrong. I think complaining is part of the game. I never thought that Israel could or can or should withstand the secretly messianic expectations launched at her from all directions, Gentiles and Jews and indeed Israelis themselves. You should complain. You ought to complain, but mind you, whenever you complain, bear in mind that you should preserve your vision, your dream, your fantasy of an ideal country, an ideal nation, whatever you have in mind, which may be different than what I have in mind. But remember the unavoidable, eternal gap between fantasy and reality. And remember that whoever commits himself or herself to fulfill completely a fantasy is bound to become a fanatic, and this is very dangerous.
Thank you.
In your book, which I recommend highly.
Thank you.
You present a very moving lecture that you delivered at a Gush Emunim settlement on the West Bank. And in that lecture, and from your account of it and a footnote at the end of the book saying, revealing their reservations about what you wrote and what you said, it seems to me that there's one clear message, and that is that it's very difficult to conduct a dialogue with them because, as you aptly put it, they see themselves as the earthly representative of some divine plan. And it's very difficult to carry on communication when one group sees themselves that way. What other segments of the Israeli population do you see as a possible partner in dialogue that could really lead to change in Israel?
Well, in the first place, let me correct you. It's not the dialogue with Gush Emunim which is difficult. They are dying to talk. They are dying to find some issue on which they can establish a consensus or a partial coalition with Peace Now. They are eager to talk and eventually even make the effort to listen. The difficulty is not to conduct a dialogue. The difficulty is to move them from where they are. But then I am stubborn myself, so who am I to complain? I would say that the key thing in Israel right now is to try to convince the shaky middle or the hesitant middle, the non-fanatic middle, which is still the majority, that annexation is bad, not just morally bad, not just ethically bad, but dangerous to the very future of the country. To convince this majority, middle of the road, nice, well-meaning people, some of them just pragmatic hawks, nothing else, for fear. No religious zealots, no crazy fringes, to convince those people that annexation is a bad deal. And this, I believe, can be done. And this is what Peace Now is mostly about, when it doesn't err, and it does from time to time.
I have a question.
Yes, please.
I actually have a comment and then a question. I really want to challenge your assumption of American Jewry and diaspora Jewry as a museum piece. I feel very, very strongly that you're wrong, and I really want to challenge that. I think that America and Israel have to be working as partners, and that I think it's important for you and for Israelis. I was in Israel this summer myself, and I think it's important for Israelis to understand what the collective creation of the American Jewish community is and what it has to offer to Israeli Jewry. And I just want to go into that a little bit.
Go ahead.
I think that the American Jewish community, especially in the last 15 years, as a result of something that I call the movement for Jewish renewal, has managed to really bring about a synthesis of both political and religious thought. Movements like Brera, New Jewish Agenda, which are informing a politic that is based on both a religious and secular understanding that tries to look at the issues of feminism, community, politics in a more comprehensive way, and that things like the Chavurah movement. The Chavurah movement did not get its creation in Israel. It had its creation in the United States because of Jews who were looking for a way to revivify American Jewish life that was not a museum piece, that didn't just want to dust off the glass cases, but really wanted to say what is an authentic Jewish response in America. And I think it's terribly unfair of you to call American Jewish life a museum piece.
Well, I'm so happy to find out that my Zionist challenge got right into your guts, because that's what I meant it to do. Let me say just this. 2 years ago, I spoke here in Boston, to a different audience, I suppose, about Israeli literature, mostly about Brenner, who assumed that there was no hope for Zionism, that the Jewish people was going down the drain, that everything was lost and doomed. Eventually, it so happened that his own real-life models, his own characters, so to speak, got so angry with the way he presented them that they stepped right out of his stories and right out of their own skins to prove to him that they were not at all what they really were. And it so happened that his own characters became his refuters. Now, if this happens to me, and with or without connection to my challenge, there will materialize something which I haven't witnessed yet, maybe as a result of my ignorance, something which I haven't witnessed yet. That is another impressive collective creation in America. I'd be embarrassed and happy.
Good evening. I wanted to ask you a question about your writing. Is there difficulty in your writing in the different... I believe you worked on The Seventh Day, is that correct? Part of the collaborative effort for that?
Yes.
And your novel of fiction elsewhere, perhaps, in Touch the Water, Touch the Wind. Is there difficulty in moving from these different types of writing for you, some of which are fiction as we traditionally know it, Touch the Water, Touch the Wind, which is completely lyrical in its essence, and also a book like Touch the Water, Touch the Wind, the The struggles of the protagonists, the main characters in the book, do those relate to the challenge you've issued here tonight, in effect, to the audience?
Well, I'm reluctant to discuss here any of my books. It's always difficult, especially a book which I'm not sure to what an extent it's known here. But let me tell you this. As I said to some friends earlier, I don't really like the English word fiction. To me, my ambition is not to write fiction, but to tell stories. I am a storyteller. Now, if you come to think about it in these terms, my present book, which is semi-documentary, and my novels and stories somehow belong in the same family. They are not necessarily identical, but they belong in the same family. In doing this book, I was doing the traditional role of the storyteller, going to a God-forsaken little village, recording the voices, collecting the local stories, going to the next village, pouring the stories of the first one on the next, gathering those stories and going to the third one. So it's just for me a different way of doing something which I've been doing most of my life. And the scholarly urge to put me neatly into a certain box and to get irritated when I sort of get out of the box where they put me is none of my business, really.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I'll take two more questions with your permission. Yes, please.
You mentioned here 2 times the people of Beit Shemesh,
Mhm.
and in your story you let them speak, and you don't want to interfere. And you say that your position on those issues is very well known. I guess I don't know your position on the issues that the Oriental Jews raised before you in Beit Shemesh. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, to put it in a nutshell, I think my partners in conversation in Beit Shemesh had a very powerful complaint, and a very convincing one too. Namely, that the socialist Labour Party funding fathers of Israel, the Ben-Gurion generation, in absorbing the mass immigration, especially from North Africa, but also from other countries, were innocently guilty of wanting to reform, change, and reshape those people immediately and at all cost, so as to turn them or their parents into the image of their very own self, assuming that they are doing or bringing a great blessing. Mind you, it was not negligence. On the contrary, they have poured on those people every blessing they could, all the blessings of their brand of social democracy, but at the same time deprived and perhaps humiliated their system of values, their religious convictions, their ethnic traditions, in short, their own kind of Judaism. Now, that was what I would call an innocent sin. And in a way, I think the fact that the Beit Shemesh people are now outspoken and make themselves heard and scream at the tops of their lungs is a bit of a blessing. I was a lot more worried when this part of Israel was humbly quiet. I am a lot less worried when it screams at me what it screamed at me. Now, the fact that I didn't answer back in the book is not necessarily because I agree with their political consequences and conclusions. I think they are wrong from their own point of view. But it was a lot more important for me to give them a very fair hearing, and if necessary, to lend them my own voice, than to argue with them or change their minds. One more question. Yes.
Yeah, I would like to further amplify the Israeli diaspora dialogue. I think about up until very recently, I would have agreed with you that there has not been any collective creativity in the diaspora, in American Jewry. I think that I also agree, though, that very recently there's been at least a cultural revival, and it can be seen in the music and theater spheres and things like that. But the question I had is, so I believe maybe that diaspora Jewry could be a side stage. Maybe it's not the main stage, but it could be at least a side stage. Is it possible to be a Zionist and at the same time, in a sense, be a Bundist, be a cultural Bundist, in the sense, be someone who's really concerned with Israel, who's Israeli-oriented, and at the same time be oriented towards creating an authentic Jewish culture and Jewish political life in the diaspora? I think that part of the reason for the revival of Jewish culture is that in the United States and a diaspora Jewish culture is that the imported Zionist culture that has existed for so long here became so inauthentic and so artificial. And essentially the Zionist movement in the United States had degenerated and has degenerated into, you know, an I Love Israel club or a support for Israel club, which is not true Zionism.
Well, look, as I said, collective creation had occurred in past diasporas. Now let's make a deal. You people do surprise me, and I for my part promise that if this materializes, I shall not stand there saying there is no such animal. That's a promise. Good night.
I want to thank Amos Oz for a very exciting evening. It even excited some opposition, as you see. But I would like to inform you that in the rear of the room there is a table at which you can sign up for the mailing list of the Friends of Peace Now, and there is also literature of the Friends of Peace Now movement available at that table. Thank you.